Hey everyone! In today's video, I'll be talking about layouts. In my opinion, it's a very overlooked topic, maybe deliberately overlooked. And the reason for that is that a layout is more of an abstract component. It's more difficult to grasp. And systematizing layouts can be risky. It's very easy to break something in the process of doing so. So it's not surprising that we want to avoid it. However, often the difference between an app or a website that looks just okay and an app that looks stunning, professional, clean, well put together comes down to having a layout system. And having a clear layout system is also what's going to help you ship new stuff faster while keeping the amount of visual bugs to a minimum. With that said, in this video, I'll be sharing a real use case study with the only exception that I swapped out the real app for a made up example. Before we get started, I just want to walk you through my fake example. So this example is an online digital magazine. Of course, it has some way to view a list of articles and a way to read those articles. It also has a list of courses and a way to dive deeper and find out about what those courses are. And of course, it can have more stuff like awards events, maybe some ways to like log in, log out. But to keep this tutorial short, I will just stick with the article view and the courses view. Let's start with problems. The first one is, as mentioned before, layouts is a difficult concept to grasp. We're used to thinking of our components as something very concrete, like a button or a card or a modal, but layouts, it's something entirely different. If we're talking in terms of figure versus ground, like typically our components are the figure, but layouts are the backdrop. And now onto the problems caused by lack of layouts. The first one is that there is a high risk of something breaking or simply not looking good. For example, here we have our layout, and at a certain breakpoint, we can see that our cards get way too narrow. And ideally, this should be like in a column layout, but it just doesn't look good. The next problem is tiny visual discrepancies. While most of your site or app visitors will not notice them consciously, they will most likely register them subconsciously. And if similar layouts don't have same consistent feel, it's just not going to be very clean. So for example, we're looking here at our article view and at our course view. And we can see that essentially these layouts are the same, but like this one has more margin at the top, this one has less, and then this one has 16 pixels to the left and the right. And this one has like 24 on the left, but still 16 on the right. And the reason this problem usually happens is because of the next one, which is too many code components. The reason this happens is there could be several. The first one is that maybe the articles view and the courses view was first designed by different designers and then developed by different developers who maybe didn't know that those are similar components and could be combined. The second reason is that maybe initially courses view was different from the articles view, so it made sense to have different layouts. Another reason, going back to code, is that maybe we had like one layout that was in a specific repository and not in the design system, and then it was easier and faster to duplicate it elsewhere as opposed to go through the pain of moving into design system and then having to do visual regression testing. Anyway, it's natural to end up with multiple similar layout components, but at some point it is worth to sit down and give it some time and really consolidate them. Another thing I want to add is that often these layout components, they don't have meaningful names. For example, we have something like generic layout, like it's very hard to tell what it actually means. Or we can have something very specific like course layout, which then we can, of course, use in some other case, but then it's going to be like confusing because it's not going to be clear right away that course layout is also used inside articles. Okay, so you decide to revamp your layouts, and the first thing to do is an audit, starting with just what do we currently have, both from the visual side and inside code. If you currently don't have an app yet and you're just starting out, it is, of course, worth thinking about layouts, but I probably would not spend too much time fixating on them because things are most likely to change once you start developing, and you may end up doing this whole process again, which is totally okay. And of course, if you take some time beforehand to really think about it, you'll probably have less work to do in the future. But anyway, first thing is figure out what you currently have. After that, you're going to start thinking about like, okay, do we have any like similar views that could be consolidated into one layout? The third point is it worth making any design trade-offs? Like, are there any differences between the two views that could be consolidated that are maybe not as important from design perspective, and it would make more sense making them the same? And the last point is how granular do we want to get in structuring our layouts? So first, let's go back to this page that I had with my fake example. And we're just going to take a look at what we currently have here. So we have our articles feed view and we have our courses view. And we can tell that like both the articles and the courses, they have a sidebar. There are different sidebars, but for a layout component, that doesn't really matter. If we inspect this closely, we can tell that there is some differences with the margins. For example, this one has the top of 64. This one has 80. So this could be one of those design trade-offs where we can be like, okay, let's just decide that it's going to be 64. Then another thing that, yeah, we have like this awkward layout here, but we want it to look something more like this. And then, yeah, we might have like some visual differences between like the mobile view. We would also want to make this the same. Also, just to note, I am showing like real Figma designs here, but you could also be just working with screenshots. That's totally fine. Now, looking at these two other views here, the article view and then the course view, we could also resolve some of the minor visual differences between them and consolidate them to use one layout component. To put all this together, we're going to have our articles view, our courses view, and we're going to come up with a template like this where we specify all the spacings that we want. And then for our second one, so for our article view and our course view, we're also going to do the same thing. And this is where the last question, the granularity, comes in. So technically, I could just have one block here that just says content, but maybe we decide to make it a little more granular and have like a slot for a picture, slot for a title, which might contain either just a title or like a title and some information like the author name and the date. And then we have the article itself. Generally, I would try not to get super granular because you may end up with some new type of view that does not fit into this specific structure. But if you made the layout component more relaxed, it would have worked well. The real thing is that even if you just get all the spacing around right, that's already huge. As you're doing this audit, you may realize that you only have two distinct layout types. However, the thing to remember is that you might have two distinct views, but then you also have at least 3 breakpoints for each view. So technically it's like 6 layouts. And if currently you have like 6 code components, then you're managing like 18 different layouts if we count the breakpoints. The next step is implementation, and implementation starts with naming. Once you identified your layouts, you need to give them meaningful names, something that's neither too specific nor too general. As a side note, I absolutely love this excerpt from Alla Khalmatova's design system book. A good name means that it is focused, memorable, and embodies the purpose of the module it represents. So try to keep this as your main goal. Create good names, have them documented, and make sure that when you say a specific layout name, that everyone knows what exactly you're referring to. So maybe for our first layout type here, we can call it something like a feed layout. So it's not too generic and it's not super specific like courses view or articles view. Technically, if we were to create something else entirely that has this similar structure, it has a high chance of fitting into this layout name. And I would agree that feed maybe sounds a little too boring. So if you are feeling more creative, you can maybe do something like Explorer layout or I don't know, just something more creative. And then for our second one, we could call it like a reader layout. So here we just want our visitors to concentrate on this one specific thing, that whether they're reading an article or learning more about the course. And again, if we have some other view that has the structure, most likely it will fit into the same like reader purpose. The next step of implementation is figuring out how many breakpoints you have and what your layouts are going to look like at each breakpoint. If your developers are using a framework like Chakra, it does already come with default breakpoints. So the first thing that you should do is figure out what those breakpoints are. You can either ask your developers or just check the documentation and then see whether your layouts can fit into those breakpoints. And maybe they will, and that would be great because then you'll get your layouts implemented faster. It is also a possibility that you may need to tweak the breakpoints, then tweak your layouts and go through several cycles of that. That's normal, but again, if you can work with the default breakpoints, that just makes the whole process faster. So with our example here, let's say we have 3 breakpoints, one for the desktop or laptop, one for iPad, tablet, and then another one for a phone. And then we see how we can take our layout and how we want it to adjust those different breakpoints. And of course, we would do it for all the layout types that we have. The next step of implementation is rollout, meaning do you want to implement your new layouts as entirely new components and then delete all of the existing layout components while replacing to make sure that nothing breaks? Or do you want to take an existing layout component and modify it and maybe move it from some random repository into design system repository. So personally, I like having one like clean cut where I get the new components implemented or modify the existing ones. In that same pull request, I delete all of the older components, replace all of the existing instances. And the reason I love doing this way is first, I get to remove tons and tons of code. And the second is that I want no traces to be left of any old components to make sure that no one is accidentally using them. So I understand that in the case of something as drastic as layouts, it does make sense to take it slower. So please do if that's something that will make you feel safer. The last point about implementation is a note on Figma. So in Figma, you can't really create a layout component that would work in the same way as the code component would, but it may not even really be as necessary as long as everyone is aligned on what the names of the layouts are. So if everyone knows what a reader layout is, then when a designer hands off a new design and just writes this should use reader layout, then developers know exactly which component they should be using and they don't need to examine every single margin or padding. Of course, there is still a way to set up more or less template or page level components in Figma, and you can do that. So what I did in this example here is I have a separate component for my feed layout and my reader layout. Inside the feed layout, we have components for 3 different breakpoints, and we have the 2 examples, one for the articles, one for courses. And I also included a more or less a blank example that just has the header and then kind of the slots of here's you would have your sidebar, here's you have your feed. So technically a designer could use this template and then detach it, add their own stuff. The same thing goes for this reader layout below. If your designers are super advanced and can work with auto layout very well and also know how to use slots, in that case, they can just use this component and don't need to detach it. You can just, let's say, turn this stuff into its own separate component, and then they can use a slot level subcomponents to swap it out. I'm not going to show it here today, but if you're interested in learning how that could work, please let me know, and I'd love to make a separate video for that. Lastly, once you have it all implemented, or as you have all of this implemented, you do want to make sure that you document your decisions. For example, here's what we did at Carrot. We have a page in our documentation called layout, and we did have 2 layouts. So one is called dashboard, and another one is focus. All it has is just the links to the Figma component, link to the component in GitHub, and then it has just some annotations of how it should look at certain breakpoints and the correct spacings between elements. After you go through the implementation, you'll get to reap the benefits of some great results, which are there will be less visual discrepancies, bugs, so there will be less time wasted fixing those. From the code perspective, it will be cleaner. There will be less of it to manage. And if you decide to implement new stuff, let's say for our fake example here, we decide to add something like events, it will be much faster to implement that. And maybe you don't even need to worry as much about testing it very intensely because you already know how it's going to behave at all the breakpoints. Of course, you still want to do that, but it's understandable that sometimes, especially at a startup, if you don't have QA engineers, you may just not end up testing as thoroughly. And having systematized layouts will just give you one extra level of confidence. Anyway, this is everything that I wanted to go over in this video. We could definitely take it into multiple different directions. So if there's anything that I can expand on, please let me know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.